This is The Discourse with Dr. Ken.
We're back on another installment of the Discourse with Dr. Ken. Okay, my name is Solomon Ikioda. Today we are going to be looking at the topic, inflation, enemy of the government or enemy of the society. Dr. Ken is with us. I think, Dr. Ken, it looks like you're back in the UK now. We actually need a satellite to track you. Looks like you're back in the UK.
Yes, I'm back. Thanks, Solo. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, listeners, for joining once again this Sunday. Yes, I'm back across the channels back. This is such a topical discussion that I couldn't have missed it, sitting in my most comfort zone.
Okay, you are welcome. Yes, inflation, enemy of government or enemy of the people. We have an eminent guest with us here today to deal with that subject, but it's appropriate that I introduce him and give his credentials. Dr. Kechukwu Kelikume leads sessions in microeconomic and macroeconomic environments of business and agribusiness. He actually said something to that point, that these days is known more for agribusiness than economics. He leads this function at the Lagos Business School. Dr. Kelikume obtained his doctoral degree in economics from the Swiss Management Center, SMC University, Switzerland. He's an economist with over 22 years of teaching experience in training and facilitating learning across 3 universities: Covenant University, the University of Benin, and Lagos Business School. Dr. Kelikume's research interests are in microeconomics, macroeconomics, econometrics, agriculture, and agribusiness, especially as they relate with the Nigerian and African experience in addressing the food crisis in Africa. Currently, Dr. Kelikume is director of the Lagos Business School Agribusiness Management Program at the Lagos Business School. Dr. Kelikume, you're welcome to the discourse.
Thank you, Sir
Ken.
Thank you, Dr. Ken.
Dr. Kelikume, I like it's Latin. It says, Felis qui potui rerum cognoscere causas. It's Latin. It's actually the motto of the London School of Economics. I think it is pertinent to angles that we'll be looking at today. What it actually says, Felis qui potui rerum cognoscere causas, is happy is the man who finds out the cause of things. So this is something that has befuddled a lot of people. Okay, right now everybody is suffering it in one way or the other. Prices of all commodities have increased across board more than 300% in some cases. This time last year, bread that was 350 naira. I know it's 1,000 naira or 1,150. Okay, increase in food and medicines, okay, have hit the hardest. You economists, you call it inflation. Okay, how can the man on the street make sense of what is going on? How does this affect the price of Gary? What's going on? What's happening?
So the truth about it is that no one tells the deaf and dumb that there's war in town. He sees everyone running and he starts running. The common man, the man on the streets today, is actually running because everybody is running. The rich, the poor, the have-nots. It is actually affecting everybody. So he lives on his meager income of probably 1,500 naira a day or 30,000 naira a month. Suddenly he discovers that his 30,000 naira can no longer buy him bread. It can no longer take him home. It can no longer buy his medicine when he's sick. So he's at a loss of what to do. In fact, most of the people you call within that income hierarchy or ladder are now resorting to prayers. They're now going back to God to say, how do we get out of this? So it's a pathetic case for Nigeria. The poor are actually in trouble.
Well, I want to expect that the first thing that people will want to know when we're in trouble is how do we get out of it? But Dr. Ken is here with us. He will have his first question.
Yes, what a topical conversation, because nobody is more troubled now on the globe, if I can say that, than Nigerians. A situation where we don't have a very clear path. Nobody knows what is going to happen tomorrow. In fact, somebody told me that the tail is wagging the dog, and can imagine that scenario where the tail wags the dog. So we're going to come to inflation. We're going to come to other indices of economics during the course of the conversation, measuring inflation. But I'm happy that Professor Kelikume is able to take us through the economics of Nigeria in general. But the question I want to begin with is, Nigeria, every time I look at Nigeria, I see an unbalanced income pyramid. So that is the nature and reflection of Nigeria economy. A situation where 10% of the population enjoy 90% of national resources, whereas 90% of population enjoy 10% of national resources. Is this not an anomaly? How does this mirror in the picture of more civilized climes, or is it normal?
So that question, if you look at the income disparity, economists usually use the Gini coefficient to actually assess the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. Now, it's a trend that is actually common amongst undeveloped countries in the world. In fact, there are 3 top countries where they've been able to close the income gap. I think you have Slovenia, you have Czechoslovakia, and one other country that has been able to close that gap. But for Nigeria, it's almost the same thing when you look at the United States, the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So it's not a problem that is peculiar to Nigeria alone. The top 1% are actually the ones actually enjoying the economy, the wealth of the economy. It's a problem, it's an anomaly. But then we need to close the gap. We need to do certain things in order to close this narrative, which we are currently not doing. There's no social safety net currently that is actually bridging the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So like there's another proverb here that says, the poor man is not sleeping because he's hungry. The rich man is unable to sleep because he's afraid the poor man is not sleeping. So we have a scenario where those who have raised high walls, have actually raised their gates so high that they're afraid that the poor man will rise up against them. Meanwhile, the poor man cannot sleep because of hunger. The rich man cannot sleep because he's afraid the poor man will attack him someday. So it's a terrible, pathetic story for Nigeria, where we have so many poor people and very few people are actually appropriating the wealth of the country.
Okay, good. Talking figures now, there is something that is related to that. Okay? Haves and the have-nots, urban, rural, and the corporate and the retail. If we look in this country as well, we'll find out that in the economy, about 40% of the total GDP is essentially coming from the informal economy. And then policies have a tendency of being designed with a deliberate consideration only for the former. Okay? Is this not a potential for crisis and social disorder when policies are not designed with consideration for the people who operate in the informal economy?
I think it's an anomaly and it's a big problem. A clear example is the new Niger Bridge that the government actually spent about 336 billion. As soon as that bridge was commissioned, 1 month after it was commissioned, the have-nots or the informal sector, or I don't know what to call them, actually started pulling down the rails, cutting them down to turn them into income generation or whatever. So they started destroying what the government has actually created to help the people. So there's a problem when you look at the informal sector. We have more than 40 or 50% within that category called the informal sector. And the biggest challenge is that our GDP is grossly underestimated if we do not capture the informal sector. As I was driving my car coming to Ikoyi this morning, I looked around, and what you can find is that you find those people who are actually taxing, collecting money from the tout, collecting money from the bus drivers. You see them taking money. That's part of the informal sector. Who are they accountable to? Who are they sending those money to? On a daily basis, there are people who we have not formalized in terms of formalizing their business. They are the artisans, the traders, the hawkers, the miscreants, those that are doing small business in Nigeria. There are so many that it is so difficult to actually capture their number. Now, these people are outside the income bracket. Again, government cannot tax people that are outside their net, their tax net. So it's a problem. It creates a lot of linkage in terms of revenue aggregation for the government. And I think if we don't begin to formalize and identify and trace these people, it's a big loss for the government.
I'm very happy you used the word formalize, because I think it's the biggest bane of underdeveloping countries, because underdeveloped countries, because I hear people say developing countries. In the context of Nigeria, I don't see development, so I struggle to call it developing countries. Nothing is formalized, not even the way we recruit leadership, not the way we aggregate our GDP, not even the way we formalize and put together conversation. Because what we are discussing today is not new to any Nigerian, be it at the top or bottom of the pyramid. Yet, it's a conversation that has been going on and on and on for more than 40 years. Yet, we claim we are one of the most brilliant people on the earth. We are the most educated black race among the black race anywhere in the world. I see a bedlam, I see a predicament. How come is it difficult for Nigerians to put themselves together in terms of thought process and implementation?
I think we will trace this back to our formal educational system. We got it wrong in the late 70s and in the early 80s. We didn't put our house in order. As at that time, we started driving certification. We created a gulf. We created a gulf between those who were attending polytechnics, the ONDs, the HNDs, and the degree holders. We created a gap, making it clear that if you don't have a degree, you are nobody. We also created a gap in terms of employing those who were technically oriented from the polytechnic and the monotechnics. And that has come back to affect us today. It is hurting us big time today. Everybody has certificates, but nobody is thinking right. We're all carrying knowledge in our heads. We cannot think. And that's why we see, for example, you look at the Lekki corridor, where we are constructing the new expressway from Ekpe down to Abraham Adesanya, and we call it the new Lagos. There's a refinery there, and we're not making provision for light rail. We're also not mapping out parks where cars will park, where individuals and citizens will park their car if they are going to use the tram or the light rail. We're not doing that, and we're saying we have a mega city in our hand. I don't know how. It appears we're not thinking.
It's very unfortunate, because even when we seem to think that we know, but I know clearly that there's a difference between knowing and understanding. I'll talk more about the economy. The economy was battered by the currency redesign program. GDP growth slowed by 2.31% in quarter 1, 2023, from 3.52 in 2022. Then came the petrol subsidy removal and the exchange rate depreciation, as we've seen today. Is this the right therapy for another recipe, or another recipe for disaster, or even effort in futility?
This is The Discourse with Dr. Ken.
the topic of the day, which is inflation. But I wanted to lay the foundation by discussing the economy generally, especially with things that happened in the most recent past. Professor Kelikume, I was saying that the Nigerian the Nigerian economy was battered by the currency redesign program. In the process, GDP growth slowed to 2.31% in quarter 1, 2023 from 3.52% in 2022, last quarter. Then came the petrol subsidy removal and the exchange rate depreciation. Is this the right therapy or another recipe for disaster?
We had a problem, and this problem we can actually trace it down to the Goodluck Jonathan's era. So we've had 16 years of poor governance. If we add the Goodluck Jonathan's era, then we add the Buhari's era, we've had 16 years of poor governance. And this poor governance, we link it to the challenges and the mono economy that we run as a state. Our country was driven by crude. If you look at the proportion of our exports, crude still takes about 91% in terms of our export revenue. And that commodity, we've had problems with that commodity in terms of projection, sales. If you look at our projection during the Goodluck Jonathan's era and during the Buhari's era, the last administration, was that we were going to do a 2.2 million barrels per day. We never got there. It got so bad that we crashed to 900,000 barrels per day. The level of theft, oil theft, increased. Insecurity in the Niger Delta, oil theft increased, meaning making it difficult for the government to appropriate revenue from that sector. So we had a problem, and that problem we probably link it to the revenue gap. So then came this government, and we knew we had a problem. We knew there was a subsidy crisis. We knew there was a gap between the autonomous foreign exchange market and the black market. Arbitrages were everywhere. The gap became so wide. But in the last dispensation, where we had the Soludo era and the Sanusi era, they were able to hold forth the exchange rate using the dirty flows exchange rate management system. They were able to hold forth, and we were able to chase out arbitrages from the market. The margin was so thin, the margin between the black market and the interbank foreign exchange market. But all that changed during the Emefiele, where we had this wide gap. So we knew we had a problem. We needed to unify the exchange rates. But the timing, so for all I can say here is that the timing was actually wrong. There was no consultation. It just hit us directly. And you don't solve problems by creating another problem. In an attempt to solve one problem, we have created multiple problems. These multiple problems are actually not so easy to solve. So we took out subsidy, we did not prepare for the common man. We don't have equitable means of transporting, moving people from place to place. We currently don't have it. The buses we have on our roads are rickety buses. Now these buses run on petrol, they don't run on gas. We have a problem. The government came up and threw this thing at us. It was so sudden, it was shock therapy. This shock therapy at best, our class as ad hoc policies, which we've been carrying on all this while. You just shock the system with ad hoc policy, thinking that things would shift, that will shift the needle. What we've done is that we've created more problems. And how we are going to solve this problem with palliative, I don't think we will get it right with those palliative. Because those palliative that we're talking about is going to trigger, it's not going to trigger productivity, but rather it's going to push up the supply-demand gap. And when demand is chasing fuel supply, you're going to have what? Inflation, further inflation. And that is what we are seeing. So for me, it's actually a shock therapy that we probably would have gone the other way around by doing more of consultation before we jump into this shock therapy. Thank you.
Okay, not having prepared for the common man like you said, okay, we seem to have a tactical therapy for the problem, which is the issue of the palliative that you mentioned. So now, the palliative, is this a conduit for leakages? Total palliative is projected at 500 billion. For example, that is 0.25 of the GDP. Is this an inadequate dose? Or should a material palliative not be at least up to 10 trillion, which is about, say, 5% of the GDP? Is it that palliatives outright will not work at all? Is there any way in which it will work if it were raised? Because that seems to be the conversation that a good deal of the populace is having.
So there are actually two schools of thought here. If you take the classical economists, they say in the area where you have cyclical fluctuation of long-run growth, the classical economics suggests that you do nothing. That usually the hand of God is embedded in every system, and it tends to propel that system back to equilibrium in the long run. But the question was, how long is the long run? Is it when we're all dead? But then came the Keynesians, who now said that since we cannot define the long run, there's a problem with aggregate demand, that people are not buying. The reasons why they're not buying is because there's a shortfall in aggregate demand. In order to make people buy, we need to stimulate the economy by pushing shock therapy. We need to fund people. In fact, literally they say, pay people to dig trenches and pay others to close the trench and ask them to go to the market to buy. But this is where you have an economic crisis, an economic recession. Our own case was not a recession. We've come out of the recession. We were in a state of moving from one government to another, and suddenly the government came out with shock therapy, and this shock therapy created a bigger problem, reducing the buying power of the people, creating that shortfall in that aggregate demand. Now you want to use the same Keynesian framework, palliative, which we used during the COVID era. And I tell you, what was the result during COVID? Push funds, push palliative into the hands of people. If you do that, so it doesn't matter whether you're doing 5% or whether you're doing 10%. What matters here is that, do you have the vehicles that will make palliative work? Do you have the right infrastructure? Do you have the right legal environment of business? Do you have power? Do you have the institutions that drives growth? If you don't have all of this, and you're using this shock therapy of palliative, it will end up buying food. It will end up solving the problem of the belly. It will end up putting money in the hands of people and leading them to buy. And in the short run, you will see palliative chasing what? Further inflation. That's my take here.
This is actually troubling, because what a palliative really is relieving symptoms without dealing with the cause, okay, of the condition. So it's a tough place where we are, Dr. Ken.
It's a predicament actually. I don't know if you have any questions on the dashboard. Otherwise, I would have asked them, because what a topic today. I'm sure all the listeners listening, like they said, the shit has hit the fan. Prof mentioned that it's not a question of being rich now or poor. Everybody's equity is eroded in one way or the other. Those who do not have, who are hanging in there completely now down the pyramid. So we now go to inflation. I know that Prof has mentioned inflation so many times in the course of today's conversation. But let's bring it to the common man. Prices of all commodities have increased across board by more than 100%, in fact. Increase in food and medicines hit the hardest, like Prof had mentioned earlier in the program. You economists call it inflation. How can the man on the street make sense of what is going on? What does he understand as inflation, Prof?
So we actually started with that question where we said the man on the street does not need to define it as inflation. I started by saying that no one tells a deaf and dumb that there's war in town. He sees people,
that the market has closed.
Or the market has closed. He just sees people running and he starts running. So the poor man, the man in the streets, now realizes that his meager income can no longer take him home. He cannot pay his rent. He cannot feed him. you cannot clothe him. The worst is if he's sick, no hospital will take care of him because he has no money to actually pay for his Medicare. So it's a big problem for the common man, especially those that are earning between 30,000 and 50,000 a month. It's a very big problem. How they are surviving, I do not know. How the poor man is surviving today, I don't know. How they are moving around, because the transportation cost, what it used to cost them 500 naira to move around, is now in the neighborhood of 1,500 and 2,000 naira. So where they get the money and how they move. So you don't need to define inflation to the poor man. He sees that tomato is so expensive, onion is expensive, a meal is now very expensive. And the way we look at it, what most people do is that they make comparisons. Say, if you convert what it cost me to take a meal in UK, they forget that it is our naira that has been gyrating. And those countries, theirs has been stable. So they forget that ours has been very volatile since 1986. It has been volatile since 1986, whilst those other countries have been stable. So we have a problem. And I wonder, and I don't understand how the poor man is coping today. I remember the program where, I listened to a program where a bus driver was actually weeping that he spends 6,000 naira paying touts and paying police. He ends up going home with 1,500 naira. And he kept on lamenting that, what will 1,500 naira do for me and my family? That's the situation the poor man is facing today. Thank you.
In fact, I'm just struggling not to be depressed because it's not even an ICU thing. The economy and the common man. In fact, everybody for that matter is an ICU in Nigeria. Thank God we sell hope, but like they say, you can only serve hope at breakfast. You can't serve hope during dinner. So something needs to give. But when we continue to discuss economics, there's something called stagflation. What is this, bro? I remember that typically inflation and unemployment have inverse relationship. Is that what it calls stagflation? Let's not discuss it for the sake of it.
So stagflation is not inflation, and stagflation is not an unemployment.
Yeah.
Inflation to the layman is where too much money is actually chasing too few goods, meaning there's a supply-demand gap. So people have money, but they cannot find. They want to buy, but there's scarcity of productive goods. So prices are bound to go up because there's scarcity. That's where you have inflation. Unemployment is where you find able-bodied men who can work, but are moving around. They cannot find job. This creates unemployment. But there's a technical relationship between inflation and unemployment. The Philip curve in economics says that there's an inverse functional relationship between inflation and unemployment. Every time you try to solve inflation, you create unemployment. And every time you try to solve unemployment, you create inflation. You pursue one policy to fight inflation, tight monetary policy to fight inflation. You use interest rate, you mop up excess liquidity, you create problem for companies that will need money to actually employ more people. So they cut down unemployment. So when you fight inflation, you create unemployment. When you fight unemployment, you create inflation. These two variables do not move together. What we have today is that since 2015, inflation and unemployment are not moving in a negative direction. They are moving in the same direction, going pari passu. Now, when inflation and unemployment is going in the upward direction, unemployment today is 33%, inflation today is 22 points, above almost 23%. So you have these two variables going in the same direction. When you now add growth, GDP growth, and GDP is negative, so if unemployment is rising, inflation is rising, and GDP is negative, declining and is negative, that's where you have a stagflation. During period of economic stagflation, monetary policy collapses. If you're using monetary policy as an antidote to solve the problem, it will not work. Fiscal policy also collapses, it will not work. You need a special vehicle to solve the problem of stagflation.
Thank you, Doctor. You're going to be telling us about this special vehicle because what seems to be coming through is how come Nigeria's inflation defies monetary policy therapy.
This is The Discourse with Dr. Ken.
Dr. Kelikume, how come Nigeria's inflation defies monetary policy therapy?
Now the truth is that when you have inflation, you invoke monetary policy rule. You use a tight monetary policy to actually address the inflationary trend. And a tight monetary policy simply means you raise, the CBN uses monetary policy rates. You raise monetary policy rates and you mop up excess liquidity. So using monetary policy means that you raise interest rate and you try to reduce money supply. But what we've had since 2015, so I'm looking at the period where the Buhari's regime started. In 2015, inflation was 8.2%. Today, we are looking at above 22%. It was 8.2%. Monetary policy rate was 13% in 2015. Today, we've been raising monetary policy rates to fight inflation since 2015. It was 13%. We started pushing it up. Today, it is 18.75%. But the interesting part is that total stock of money supply was about 18 trillion in 2015. Today we are looking at a massive growth in the stock of money supply, which is about 64.4 trillion. You can see the margin. So whilst the monetary policy was actually addressing inflation, the government, the physical side of government was actually borrowing. We had fiscal deficit, meaning we are pushing money into the system. So we have a monetary growth that was above 100%, which means that the monetary policy did not work. The question is, why is monetary policy not addressing the inflation? We need to look at the Nigerian scenario. Like every other developing or underdeveloped market economies, where you don't have some of the infrastructures for this policy to ride on, we have a problem. Our problem is that inflation is driven more by structural rigidities. We can explain these structural rigidities. If you look at our road network, so you're bringing yam that you bought 400 naira a tuber from Benue State. You're relocating this yam to Lagos State. Now, that yam that you're moving from Benue State to Lagos State, it's going to pass through many checkpoints. And all these checkpoints, the driver keeps paying money. Before the yam took off from Benue State, there's a union, formidable union, that you must pay to before you move that truck from Benue State. The same truck pays through extortion, pays different police posts before getting to Lagos. He gets to Lagos, he cannot drop the yam at the market. Let's say he's coming to mile 12. He gets to mile 12. There are market makers and unions that before you put the yam on the ground, you're also going to pay. When you add up all of these payments, it turns out that the 400 naira a tuber yam will now be going for 2,000 naira. Monetary policy cannot address this. These are structural features embedded in the Nigerian economy. We see it across sectors. We see it showcasing itself across the transport sector. It is even more within the transport sector, where there's this extortion from place to place. You see people collecting money. At the end of the day, the transportation cost is 2,000 naira, where you're supposed to pay 500 naira. Because this young man has paid tolls different tolls that are unaccounted for, unreceipted. It doesn't get to the government purse. So this is the problem. Inflation in Nigeria is driven more by a combination of monetary futures and structural rigidities and institutional failures. And that's why monetary policy alone cannot address it.
There's a word you used there that has actually got me thinking now. You used the word extortion.
Yeah.
And you remember when we started, when we said the rerum cognoscere, because finding out the cause of things. Are we really dealing with only a problem of economics here, or a problem of morality, or something bigger?
So we're dealing with social...
Talking extortion.
So we have a social problem in our hands. We have a cultural problem, a social problem. It's almost like a way of life. If you watch this, there's this video of the latest find where a man constructed a house and was drilling oil, was actually illegally, he has illegal diesel wells in his house, and they arrested them. And you need to hear the lady was talking about, oh, my husband is just doing business. This is business. So we have a system where bad is now taken as good and good is now taken as bad. So we have a combination of social and cultural crisis in our hand. It's not just economics.
Okay. Dr. Ken seems to want to ask you a question in this regard.
Yes, I'm enjoying the flow, and there couldn't have been a better way to x-ray these programs like Professor Kelikume have done so far. In fact, part of the habit I have is that when I go to measure how much money I spend in short term, when I go for grocery, I keep the receipt. The last time I visited the UK, I kept the receipts, and this time I've gone to the same supermarket, to be specific, Sainsbury. For what I bought for £21, 80 pence, I could buy now for £22, 23 pence. Means that some insignificant increase. But Dr. Kelikume used the word our naira gyrating. In fact, when I converted that £23, it looked like a lot of money if you consider that the pounds to naira now is over 1,000. Look like a lot of money. So that makes me today live in the short term with, visiting the UK. We are literally living with, driving with the handbrake on. And you're counting on your fingers what you want to buy and what you want. But their currency is stable, which brings me to the naira. And I was smiling when you used the word that naira is gyrating. In fact, it's not only gyrating now, it's somersaulting. And if you look at it properly, you wonder whether it's not epilepsy. The naira, what are the factors that determine the value of this naira? Or is it just that it's very late?
So if you look at when we came up with unification of the exchange rate, and some analysts were saying this will bring down, this will make the naira appreciate in the markets, and I laughed. Your naira cannot appreciate on the backdrop of massaging the exchange rates. What drives the value of a country's currency is actually productivity. It has nothing to do with massaging. It has nothing to do with whether you run a fixed exchange rate or you run a multiple exchange rate or you run a dirty float. What shows up the value of your currency is what you sell to the world market. It's about demand and supply. The demand for export and the supply. So it's about import and export. The value of your export is what determines the value of your naira. If your export is in commodities in their raw state, you don't expect your naira to appreciate, because the countries that are buying your cassava starch, your cassava chips, are the same countries that are producing industrial starch and sending back the industrial starch to you at a relatively higher rate. So what we do is that we sell commodities, we sell things in their raw state, we've not added value to it. We also are not into heavy industry items. all our equipment, electrical gadgets, name it, are all imported. We rear cattle. All our belts are not produced here. In fact, we rear cattle. We eat the skin.
The skin.
We take delight in eating the skin. We do not know that the Moroccan leather is actually from Nigeria. Now that same Moroccan leather is what they use in making fine leathers and shoes and selling back to us. When you go outside and you're buying the ladies are buying the Louis Vuitton bag. Now that bag, that smooth silk bag, is actually from your pig skin. Now, we produce these things, we eat them. We've not added significant value. So unless you add value to your export goods, that's when you will show up the value of your naira. Aside your exports, there are certain other macroeconomic indicators that actually show up your currency. Number one is inflation. When prices are relatively too high, money will leave your country. The number two is your capital flow. If you look at capital inflow and capital outflow, when capital is flowing from your country, your currency would be devalued. It means people are taking out funds from your country. So you have inflation, you also have money supply. When money supply is increasing rapidly, it means the value of your country's currency is likely to go down. So these are some of the features that actually drives the value of our currency. The biggest one is that we are not producing. And that's why one of the things I say in class is that in order for you to show up the value of your currency, we must come up with that slogan, export or die. And this slogan must go around the manufacturing sector, export or die. Produce high quality goods, export or die. But this manufacturing outfit cannot export if the government has not. So when we are saying palliative, this palliative should go to sectors that are highly productive such that they can compete globally. Thank you.
Okay, there's is this Lawrence? Okay. Donatus from Bagada. We talk about the three impossible trinity of inflation, exchange rate, and interest rate. How do we navigate through this? It's a question for you, Doctor, from Donatus from Bagada.
So how do we navigate through
the three impossible trinity of inflation, exchange rate, and interest rate?
It's a complex one for us today because interest rate is high. So in order to solve inflation, you need to raise monetary policy rates. When you raise monetary policy rates, you've actually done one thing. You're trying to fight inflation. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, inflation is not a monetary phenomenon in the case of Nigeria. It is a combination of monetary and structural features in the Nigerian economy. So as you're raising monetary policy rates, you're raising interest rates, inflation is further going up. Then you now look at the exchange rate. I just talked about the exchange rate. The reasons why your currency is taking a beating is that virtually everything we have is imported from other countries. And I used to share this. How can your exchange rate go up when all the glasses that we put on, if you look at the frame that I'm having on is synthetic fiber, and this synthetic fiber is from the petrochemical sector. But then, the country where we're buying it from is Indian. Indian is a net importer of this product from countries like Nigeria. So Indian has gained in terms of technical know-how, technological breakthrough. They can actually produce things for Nigeria, but we cannot produce for them. What we give to them are commodities in their raw states. So I don't know how we're going to navigate around it, because these three are actually reinforcing each other. As you try to check inflation, it is running away from you. As you try to check exchange rate, it is creating further inflation. Remember that the high exchange rate means that the import of raw materials needed by your manufacturing sector, the cost will be high. And when the cost is high, we actually bring in imported inflation, which will add to your current inflation. So a lot of commodities you find, a lot of things we consume today that are coming from the external market, we're actually adding If we are producing here and we're importing the raw materials, we're actually adding to that cost of production, which is why inflation is likely to go up further.
Okay, as we begin to wind down, Dr. Ken, we have a question for Dr. Kelikume.
Just quickly, one or two. I still remember this exchange rate. The IMF and World Bank, they project that the naira is undervalued by 6.26%. So naira value is by them is estimated at 720 per dollar. What in your estimation will be the true value? And where are they getting these projections from? Where are they getting their inspiration from?
So I am not going to give you an estimate or a forecast of the true value of the exchange rates, because the parameters on ground will actually not hold if I give you a number. The reasons why I won't give you, so what I probably will have is a forecast. The forecast is that exchange rate is likely to go higher than what the IMF is suggesting. So the reason is, if you look at in 1985, the IMF told us, IMF World Bank told Nigeria that our currency was undervalued, that we needed to devalue our currency. As at that time, the exchange rate was 86 kobo, 0.86 naira to $1 US. The naira had more value than the US dollar. They told us that we needed to devalue our currency. They also told us that we needed to take the IMF, the structural adjustment program, as at that time. We devalued our currency. Babangida had countrywide consultation. We discussed it in the academia as at that time. Take SAP or no SAP. Eventually, we embraced the IMF structural adjustment and the World Bank structural adjustment program, and we devalued our currency. We devalued it from 0.86 naira to 1 naira 75 kobo in 1986. From that time to date, they've been telling us that our currency is overvalued, is undervalued. And each time they say it, it's a recipe for devaluation. And the more you devalue, so I don't know the end where it will lead us in terms of continue to devalue your naira because it is undervalued. Rather than tell us the simple truth, it is a supply side dynamics, not a demand side dynamics. We should go back to the supply side narrative. All we have been doing is touching the demand side. We should go back to productivity. We should begin to tell ourselves the truth. And the painful part of it is that if you begin to touch the supply side, in 8 years, in 9 years, in 10 years, you're not likely to see results. And that's why we're taking the option of the quick fix. And the quick fix has never helped us.
You can never do quick fixes forever.
It has never helped us.
Good. Let me speak for how I feel. So many things you've said. I'll be honest. There's a tendency to this installment being a bit depressing. Export or die. The prediction is that inflation will rise.
Yeah.
And you say we add value by manufacturing. We do not see that we are manufacturing, so we are not adding value. And then you say you do not see how this will end. But we keep hearing light at the end of the tunnel. How long is this tunnel? When do you think the flickers will even begin to show?
It's a very difficult question to answer when you say light at the end of the tunnel. That some school of thought is saying that we need to suffer now in order to enjoy tomorrow. We have to bear pain now in order to enjoy tomorrow. But I ask them, what kind of pain are you going to inflict on me when I'm already down? They say, he that is down need fear no fall. Many people, 70% of our population, they're already down. There's nothing to fear again. So they're already down. So how long is this tunnel you're talking about, that there's light at the end of the tunnel? I see light if we do the right thing today. But then, let me say this one thing. There's no government that you bring in, of the three parties that ran the presidential race, if you bring the three, the Obis, the Atikus, the three, none of them can actually solve the Nigerian problem in 8 years. None.
Okay.
Whatever it is. But if they start today, start putting the right structures, we are going to see the dividends. We are going to see it, say, from the 15th year, the 16th year, because they put a superstructure.
Are we seeing the right structures being put in place now?
I doubt it, because there's one. So I use this to describe it in the classroom, where we say there's a monster in the house. If you don't touch the monster, you're actually touching the symptoms.
What is this monster?
And we've been touching the symptoms. This monster is about our value system. This monster is about education. This monster is about our curriculum. This monster is that we need to go back to the drawing board to look at the kind of education that we're dishing out, the kind of value system that we now have in place. So they talk about, I don't need to work in order to be successful. That's the narrative today. What our forefathers taught us is that hard work pays. That if we work hard enough, we probably will get to the end of the tunnel. But I tell you, we are not yet there because those structures are not in place. We have problem with our health sector. And the problem with your health sector is tied to your educational sector. We have problem with the transport sector. It is tied to your educational sector. Every sector in the Nigerian economy is linked to a derailed educational and value system. And that's where I would say if we do the right thing, we will see results in 18 years.
This is a fresh angle to it. We hardly hear that. Usually we truly deal with the symptoms most of the time. And at the end of the day, the actual solution that is required is, it eludes us. Dr. Ken, as we close up, Dr. Kelikume is going to give us his choice of song. He seems to have said the proverb already. You don't tell a blind man that war is you don't tell a deaf and dumb that war is coming. Dr. Ken, what's your last word?
Well, my last word is that I wish the listeners a very good week ahead. This is a very difficult and heavy topic. Again, I repeat that we can only solve it when we plan, and the planning is addressing the fundamentals, like Professor Kelikume. We can't just keep serving hope. Hope is just meant for breakfast. You can't serve it for dinner.
Okay, on that note, thank you, Dr. Kelikume.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a tradition here of taking your favorite song. What's your song?
Jimmy Cliff, Many Rivers to Cross.
Woo!
That's a fantastic one.
And that's it on The Discourse with Dr. Ken.